The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not the smell of the cabin, though that was its own story. Mildew and mouse droppings, and 40 years of wood smoke pressed into the pine boards like a second skin. Not the smell of the valley below, that faint diesel and alfalfa drift that rose from the county road on warm afternoons. What I noticed on the morning of October 3rd, 2019, standing in a dead vineyard in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada at roughly 4,200 feet above sea level, was the smell of cold iron coming out of the ground. I'd been on the property for 6 days by then. 6 days since the lawyer in Mariposa, a small, careful man named Ellison, who wore the same brown tie both times I'd met him, had handed me a key on a ring stamped with a faded California bear, and told me, in the tone people use when they're not sure whether to offer congratulations or condolences, that my grandfather had left me everything. Everything. 4 acres of dead Zinfandel vines, a cabin that needed a new roof before December, a smokehouse with a sprung door hinge, a 1974 Ford F-100 that had been sitting on flat tires so long the rubber had begun to petrify, though the engine, I'd since discovered, still turned over with some encouragement. A root cellar, a hand pump well that worked but groaned like something was living in it, and whatever else was out there, which I had not yet had the time or nerve to fully inventory. I had turned 18 in August. I had $214 in a checking account. I did not have a plan beyond surviving the winter. The vineyard ran down a south-facing slope from the cabin, maybe 200 feet of terraced rows, the vines untended for at least a decade, long enough that the wood had gone silver and the wire had rusted to the color of dried blood. I'd gone down there that morning to see if anything was salvageable, which I suspected it wasn't. I was right, but I'd walked the rows anyway, pushing through the skeletal canes, and somewhere near the lowest terrace, where the slope flattened before it hit a drainage ditch, my boot had sunk through a thin crust of earth and struck something hard and hollow. The sound it made was not like hitting rock. It was a drum sound, a resonant, empty clang that traveled back up through my heel and into my spine. I crouched down, cleared away the loose soil with my hand, found what looked like a seam, a straight line in the earth, too straight and too regular to be geological, running east to west beneath the damp clay. I pressed my fingers into the groove. Cold iron. All right. Solid, riveted, deliberate. I sat back on my heels in the dead vineyard and looked at the ground for a long time. I didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. I walked back up to the cabin and sat at the table with a cup of coffee I'd made too strong, and I thought about what I knew. The vineyard had been planted sometime in the 1950s. My grandfather had put in the first vines the year he came. Back from Korea, according to the deed paperwork I'd found in a Folgers can on the kitchen shelf. The terrace work alone would have been months of labor. He'd had help, I assumed, though I couldn't say from where. The slope was real Appalachian clay, Hartzell series, heavy and slow draining, and terracing it would have meant cutting and moving cubic yards of subsoil by hand or with a small dozer. I knew he'd had a Farmel tractor, because the tractor shed still held its ghost. 4 rectangular impressions in the dirt floor, an oil stain the shape of a continent, one broken drag link hanging from a nail, but a train car in the ground. I went back down at 2 in the afternoon with a spade, a 6-pound breaker bar, and my grandfather's old Stanley tape measure, the fat yellow one with the worn belt clip. I cleared a 4-foot section along the seam I'd found, working slowly, keeping the blade shallow so I didn't score the iron. The clay came away in chunks. What emerged was the tip edge of something curved, not flat the way I'd imagined, but subtly domed, the way old riveted steel arcs slightly under its own weight over decades. I followed the seam another 6 feet to the east before it terminated in a corner joint. Then I moved perpendicular and found the second seam, running north to south. That gave me a corner. A definitive right-angle corner of heavy-gauge plate steel, joined with round-head rivets maybe 3/4 of an inch in diameter, set on 4-inch centers. I measured the width between the two parallel seams. 8 feet, 2 inches. That's a standard gauge freight car. I stood in the vineyard with the tape measure extended across the raw clay and let that fact settle into me. Someone had buried a railroad freight car, or at least a significant portion of one, under 200 feet of terraced vineyard, and then planted wine grapes over the top, and then tended those grapes for some number of years, and never said a word about it to anyone who was still alive to tell me. I thought about my grandfather. He'd been a quiet man, with large hands, who kept his opinions about most things to himself. He had a way of looking at a problem, a broken fence, a sick animal, a leaking pipe, where he'd just stand and look at it for a while before he did anything. I used to think that was patience. Now I was starting to wonder if it was something else. Whether some of the things he looked at for a long time, he'd already known were there. I went back to the logbook that night. I'd read it through twice already, since finding it in the tin box beneath the floorboards, but I'd been reading it the way you read something you don't yet have a reason to read carefully. Now I had a reason. I sat at the table with the Coleman lantern turned up as high as it would go without smoking, and I went through every page again slowly, the way my grandfather used to look at a broken fence. The logbook covered 7 years, 1961 through 1968. Most of it was vineyard record. Bricks readings at harvest, sulfur application dates, frost damage notes, a running account of what the creek did in wet years. The handwriting was my grandfather's, which I recognized from the handful of letters he'd written me when I was young enough that getting a letter still felt like an event. But there was a second handwriting that appeared occasionally, cramped and left leaning, making short entries in the margins. I'd noticed it before and assumed it was a hired man's notes. Now I looked at those margin entries differently. March 4th, 1963, R confirmed grade correct, set final course. August 17, 1964, roof pour complete. Cure time 28 days minimum. November 2, 1964, cover finished. He says it will hold a man standing. June 9, 1966, no seepage reported after spring. I sat with those 4 entries for a long time. The roof pour, the cover, a cure time of 28 days. Someone had not buried a train car. They had buried it intentionally, engineered it, poured concrete over it, and given it nearly a month to cure before they put soil on top. This was not concealment done in haste. This was construction. I turned to the back of the logbook where the inside cover had a pocket, the kind made from a strip of paper glued at 3 edges. I'd looked in it before and found nothing, but now I pressed it flat and felt something stiff near the bottom of the pocket. I worked it out with 2 fingers. A photograph, black and white, the edges soft with age. 2 men standing on what appeared to be raw, disturbed earth. One of them was my grandfather, younger than I'd ever known him, maybe 30 years old, in a work shirt with the sleeves rolled past the elbow. The other man I didn't recognize, older, heavier, wearing a hat. Between them, at their feet, was what looked like a portion of a steel door, unhinged and lying flat, and beside the door was a wooden crate roughly the size of a steamer's trunk. My grandfather was not looking at the camera. He was looking at the crate. I turned the photograph over. Someone had written 4 words on the back in that cramped left-leaning hand, and then stopped, as if that was all that needed to be said. Don't open it cold. I set the photograph on the table beside the lamp and looked at those 4 words for a long time. Don't open it cold. Outside, the wind had picked up since nightfall. I could hear it moving through the vineyard rows, that low-channeled sound like breath through a harmonica reed, and somewhere further up the slope a branch cracked loose and fell. February in that hollow had its own personality. Not the honest cold of January, which was at least consistent, but something meaner and more variable, the temperature swinging 15 degrees in an afternoon, ice forming on surfaces that had been dripping 2 hours before. I'd learned to read it by the way the mud on the south slope behaved. That night the mud was iron, I understood two of the four words immediately. Don't open. That part was clear enough in tone, if not in reason. It was the last word that kept pulling at me. Cold. I turned it over the way you turn a stone in a creek to see what's underneath. He could have meant temperature. Don't open it when it's cold outside. Or when the metal is cold, maybe some mechanical reason having to do with contraction and expansion. Old railroad steel moves. I'd learned that from the logbook itself, a passage from March of 1961, where he'd written about the door seals and how they'd worked better once he'd started a fire in the pit 2 hours before he needed to access whatever was inside. Or he could have meant something else entirely. Cold, as in unprepared. Cold, as in without understanding first. I picked up the logbook again and turned to the earliest entries I hadn't read carefully, the ones from before the installation, from the autumn and winter of 1959. His handwriting in those pages was less settled, the letters slightly larger, as if the hand that wrote them was still deciding what kind of hand it wanted to be. He was writing quickly about something, and the subject in those pages wasn't wine or soil chemistry or equipment. He was writing about weight, specific weights. He listed items in a column down the left margin, each with a number beside it, and the numbers were in pounds. The smallest entry was 140 pounds. The largest was just under 2,000. I didn't know yet what the items were. He hadn't given them names in those early pages, only numbers, and the column had no header. Whatever system of reference he was using, it lived somewhere else. Another document, or in his own memory, where I couldn't reach it. I closed the logbook, left the photograph where it was, face up, those four words catching the edge of the lamplight. The fire had burned low. I put 2 more pieces of oak on it without thinking about it, the automatic gesture of a person who has learned not to let heat get away from him in winter. Then I went to the window and looked out toward the vineyard. The vineyard in February looks like something that gave up a long time ago. The rows were still there. You could see them if you knew to look, the way the ground rose and fell in parallel ridges under the snow. But the vines themselves were just black wire and dead wood, knotted at the top of each post like a fist that had tightened over decades and never let go. My grandfather had planted them in 1961. That was what the deed paperwork said, the thin carbon copy sheet I'd found folded inside the back cover of the logbook's front pocket. 1961. He would have been 32 years old. I tried to picture him out there with a dibber and bare hands, pressing each root cutting into soil that probably fought him, because the soil up here in McCreary County fought everything. The snow had stopped sometime in the last hour. The clouds had thinned enough that the moon was doing something. Not full, not bright, but enough to lay a pale wash over the whole ridge. I could see the vineyard clearly, all 12 rows. The posts at the end of each row, which he had cut himself from locust. This because he had written about it, early in the logbook, in that careful handwriting he would later abandon. Locust posts will outlast me by 30 years if the ground doesn't heave them. He hadn't been wrong, and then I saw the depression. I had walked that vineyard twice since arriving, once in the gray slush of my first afternoon, and once 3 days later when the temperature had risen enough to make the going less treacherous. I had been looking at the vines both times. I hadn't been looking at the ground between the 5th and 6th row toward the far eastern end where the slope ran down before the tree line. But now, from the window, with the moonlight doing what lamplight couldn't, I could see it plainly. A long rectangular shadow in the snow, maybe 30 feet by 10. The snow was shallower there, an inch, maybe 2, where everywhere else on the vineyard it was pushing 6. The ground there was sitting higher than it should have been, or rather, it had sunk and was now reflecting that fact in the way the snow lay over it. Something underneath was holding warmth. Not much, but enough to melt from below. I stood at that window for a long time. The 2 pieces of oak I had put on the fire were catching now, and the heat at my back was starting to climb. I didn't move. I kept my eyes on that rectangular shadow. He had been making a list of weights, items without names, organized by number. The smallest was 140 pounds, the largest just under 2,000. Whatever he had buried out there in the sixth row, and I was certain now that he had buried something, he had known exactly how much it weighed. I went back to the logbook. Not to the weight list, I had memorized that already, the way you memorize something without trying to, because your brain decides it matters before you do. I went back further, to the entries from that first summer, 1961, when he had first broken ground on the Vineyard. His handwriting in those early pages was different, looser. The letters had room to breathe. Whatever had made it tightened in later years hadn't happened yet. The sixth row came up twice in July of that year. First on the 14th, a Tuesday, where he wrote only, cleared the sixth row to hardpan, found the edge at 22 feet, good drainage, will set posts by end of month. Then again, on the 28th, a single line, adjusted sixth row alignment north by 8 feet. The ground there has better structure. Better structure. I read that twice. He had moved the row, shifted it 8 feet north of where he'd first planned it. And the reason he gave himself, in his own private book that no one was supposed to read, was that the ground had better structure. But any man who had spent time laying out a vineyard would know that you don't move a row after you've cleared it to hardpan without a reason that costs you something. Moving a row in hard mountain soil by hand in the summer of 1961 was a week of work, maybe more. He moved it because something was already there, in the original line. Something he needed to plant the row over, not through. I set the logbook down on the table and stood up. The fire had settled into a low, even burn. The cabin was warm enough now that the windows had fogged at the corners. I pulled on my wool coat anyway, the heavy one, the Filson, that had been hanging on the peg by the door since I arrived. And I went to the window again. The rectangular shadow was still there in the snow. The moonlight hadn't shifted much. Out past the bare vines, out past the sixth post in the row, that shallow place in the snow sat quiet and long and exact, 30 feet, maybe a little more. I had a shovel. A good one, a long-handled no. Two with a fiberglass shaft I'd bought at the farm supply in Elkin back in October before the ground froze hard. I'd used it for the drainage trench along the north wall of the cabin. It was leaning against the woodshed wall outside, under the eave, out of the weather. I looked at the clock above the stove, 20 past 2 in the morning. The temperature outside, last I'd checked before dark, was 19 degrees. I stood at that window for another full minute. The shadow didn't move. The snow over it stayed thin and pale and wrong in a way I couldn't unfeel. I put on my boots. The cold hit my face before I even cleared the porch step. 19 degrees is a number that means something different at 2 in the morning than it does at 2 in the afternoon. It has weight at 2 in the morning. It presses on the skin around your eyes and at the hinge of your jaw, and it makes the inside of your nose feel like tin. I pulled the shovel from under the eave. The handle was cold through my gloves. I was wearing the heavy wool liners under the leather outers. The combination my grandfather had packed in the bottom of a cedar chest along with a note that said, "For when the thermometer lies to you." I didn't know what he meant by that until February of my first winter here, when it said 24 degrees and I nearly lost 2 toes checking the far fence line. The thermometer at the cabin always read 4 or 5 degrees warmer than the hollow. Something about the way the cold pooled down from the ridge. I crossed the yard. The snow was 6 inches deep, crusted over, and it made a sound with each step like a boot going through a paper bag. The vines on either side of me were bare black wire and stick, the rows running east to west, and the moonlight threw long blue shadows off each post. I counted as I walked. 3rd post, 4th, 5th. At the 6th post I stopped. The ground ahead of me was different. You couldn't see it exactly in the dark, but you could read it. The snow lay thinner over a long rectangular shape, 10 inches lower than the surrounding grade, maybe 32 feet end to end, and about 9 feet wide. I stood at the edge of it for a moment just looking. The shadow I'd seen from the window was the depression itself. The way the moonlight caught the slight angle where the settled snow dropped off at the edges. I put the shovel in at the near end and lifted my first load. The top 6 inches came easy, loose snow powder underneath the crust. Below that, I hit something harder. Not frozen earth. Something else. I scraped sideways with the blade and heard a sound I wasn't expecting. A low metallic ring like tapping the side of a cast iron pot with a knuckle. I went down on one knee. I pulled off the outer leather glove, pressed my bare fingers through the snow, and touched it. Cold metal. Flat, painted once, from the feel of it. There were traces of something rough in the surface, the ghost of a texture. I pressed harder and felt a seam. A long, straight seam running parallel to the row of vines, running deeper than I could follow with my fingers. I stood up. I looked back at the cabin, one window glowing orange. Then I picked up the shovel and kept going. I worked for 2 hours without stopping. The cold didn't matter after the first 20 minutes. My shoulders found a rhythm. Drive the blade, lift, turn, drop, and the pile on my left grew taller than my knee. I was working in a trench now, the walls of it rising on both sides, and every shovel load came off the surface of the metal clean. Not earth, not wood, metal it curved. That was the thing I hadn't understood from the first touch. The surface wasn't flat. It only felt flat because I'd pressed a small patch of it. As the trench opened up, I could see the gentle arc, maybe a 10-foot radius, running the full length of the depression. Curved metal, riveted. The rivets were spaced every 8 inches or so, running in rows along the seam I'd first felt, and when I scraped the snow away from one with my glove, I could see the head of it clearly. Domed, maybe an inch across. The surface oxidized to a dark reddish brown that looked almost black in the lantern light. I stopped shoveling sometime around 2 in the morning. Not because I was done, I was nowhere near done, but because I needed to look at what I had. The trench ran about 14 feet. In those 14 feet, I had exposed the top arc and maybe 18 inches of the near side. The near side curved inward below the snow line and disappeared into earth that wasn't frozen, because whatever was buried here had been buried a long time. Long enough for the ground to settle and pack around it, like the earth had simply decided to accept it. I held the lantern low against the metal and moved it slowly. There were letters, not carved, stenciled once, in paint that had long since gone to flaking rust-colored shadow. I could only make out pieces. What looked like the curve of a C, then a gap. Then, 3 letters that might have been ONA or OMA. Then more gap. The rest was gone. At the near end of the trench where I'd started, the metal changed. The arc flattened, a vertical surface. I pressed both hands against it and felt the difference. This was a face, not a flank, an end wall. And there, centered roughly in it, a seam that ran not horizontal but vertical, and at the right side of that seam a mechanism, circular, latched, 3 or 4 inches across, a door handle. I stood in the trench with snow at my hips, and the lantern held close, and I looked at that handle for a long time without touching it. The grandfather's logbook was back in the cabin. I'd left it on the table under the lamp. There was a page I hadn't finished reading, the one that started with September of 1961, and the words settled it finally, nobody needs to know. I picked up the shovel again. I dug for another 40 minutes. The snow had stopped some time while I wasn't paying attention, and the hollow had gone absolutely still. That particular stillness that follows a storm, where the air has weight to it and sound carries differently, as if the world has been turned down a half step. My breath came in slow columns. The lantern sat on the lip of the trench, and its light fell straight down into the excavation, without spreading the way light behaves in cold. The door was roughly 4 feet wide, maybe 5 feet tall. The latch mechanism was a wheel, cast iron, 6-spoked, the kind you'd find on a ship's hatchway or a vault. 3 of the spokes had surface corrosion that had welded them into a single mass on one side. The other three were distinct. I cleared the ice from around the wheel's housing, with the flat of the shovel blade careful, the way you'd work around a tooth you weren't certain was loose. I tried the wheel with both hands. Nothing. Not the resistance of a stuck mechanism, something more absolute, the refusal of a thing that has been closed for a very long time and does not recognize the concept of opening anymore. I went back to the cabin for the 3-pound maul and a cold chisel. The walk-up took longer than it should have. My legs were past tired into something else, a kind of mechanical operation where the body continues, because stopping is the worse option. I stood at the cabin door and looked at the logbook on the table. I did not pick it up. I found the maul hanging in the shed and the chisel in the flat wooden box under the workbench, and I went back down the slope. I seated the chisel at the junction of the latch housing and the door face and struck it 4 times, light, listening to what the metal said back to me. On the 4th strike, there was a different sound. Not the ring of solid resistance, but something that traveled, a tone that moved through the whole door, rather than just the spot I'd hit. There was space behind it. I moved the chisel to the corrosion on the wheel's frozen side and worked at it for several minutes, the maul swings getting shorter and more deliberate. A chunk of rust scale broke away. Then another. I tried the wheel again. This time it moved. Not easily, not without pain, but it moved, a quarter turn, the internal mechanism engaging with the reluctance of something waking from a long sleep. I stopped there, hands on the wheel, the lantern throwing my shadow up the earthen wall of the trench behind me. I had not eaten since morning. I thought about what the logbook had said. Nobody needs to know. I thought about who, exactly, that was written for. Then I turned the wheel the rest of the way. The latch disengaged with a sound I felt more than heard, a deep, mechanical thunk that traveled up through the wheel and into my palms and wrists and forearms. The door did not swing open. 36 years of swelled earth and settled pressure had seen to that. I set both hands flat against the door face and pushed. And when pushing accomplished nothing, I braced my boots against the trench wall and pushed again, putting my whole back into it, and the door moved. A half inch, then 2 inches, then stopped. There was a seal of organic matter along the lower edge, roots and compacted soil that had grown into the gap. I worked the pry bar into the space I'd opened and levered, and the door gave another 3 inches with a sound like tearing, a low groan that went up out of the trench into the cold air above me. I stopped and breathed. The smell hit me before I could see anything. Not rot, not the black mildew stench I'd been bracing for. Something drier than that. Old wood and clay and something faintly chemical, the residue of a sealed atmosphere, 36 years of air that had gone slowly stale behind 2 inches of steel. My lantern's light barely reached the threshold. I pulled it close and angled it through the gap. Shelves, floor to ceiling along the near wall, and on the shelves, shapes. I worked the pry bar twice more, each time gaining another few inches, until the gap was wide enough to turn sideways and pass through. I did not go in immediately. I stood at the threshold, with the lantern held out ahead of me, and let the light travel. The car was perhaps 40 feet long. The floor was wood, tongue and groove planking, warped but intact. The shelves ran the length of both walls, framed out in rough-cut lumber, and they were loaded. Canning jars by the hundreds, sealed with wax and wire bales, the contents visible through glass gone slightly amber with age. Wooden crates stacked beneath the shelves. A workbench at the far end with tools hanging above it on a pegboard. And in the center of the floor, 2 things that did not belong to any root cellar logic I could name. A steel cabinet, 4 drawers, padlocked, and beside it a canvas bundle lashed tight with leather straps, roughly the size and shape of a man lying down. I noticed I had stopped breathing again. The temperature inside the car was several degrees warmer than the trench. It had held some remnant warmth the way a root cellar does, the earth insulating against the November cold above. My breath did not fog when I finally stepped across the threshold. The lantern light caught the nearest shelf. The jars were labeled in the same hand I knew from the logbook. Ink faded but legible, and one label nearest the door read simply, "For whoever finds this first." The jar was a quart-sized ball, the old aqua-tinted glass, sealed with a rubber gasket and a wire bail that had gone the color of old pennies. I lifted it from the shelf with both hands. It was heavier than I expected. Inside, packed in what looked like dry sawdust or fine ash, was a bundle of papers folded into thirds. No food, no preserves, just paper, protected from moisture and oxygen the way my grandfather had protected everything he meant to last. I did not open it there. I set it carefully on the workbench and turned to look at the rest of the room in its full order. The canning jars numbered in the hundreds. I would count them later, on a different day, when counting felt like something other than intrusion. What I could see from the lantern light: dried beans in some, corn in others, the yellowed pack of seeds in several more, and in the ones nearest the workbench, small mechanical parts nested in oil-soaked cloth, hinges, springs, something that looked like a pocket watch movement, though much larger. He had been preserving more than food. He had been preserving capability, the means to repair things in a world where repair shops no longer existed. The wooden crates beneath the shelves held books, not a library, practical books. A Chilton manual for a 1951 Ford truck, a USDA canning guide from 1947, 2 volumes on viticulture, a hand-bound notebook separate from the logbook I already carried, this one thicker, its cover wrapped in oilcloth. I did not open that one either. Not yet. The steel cabinet with its 4 padlocked drawers stood at waist height, military surplus by the look of it, olive drab paint worn down to bare metal at the corners. I did not touch it. The canvas bundle on the floor I looked at for a long time without moving closer, lashed with 4 leather straps, each buckled tight. It was not the shape of a man, I told myself, looking at it again. It was the shape of something rolled, a tent, maybe, or a heavy coat, or a set of tools wrapped for transport. I told myself this with some conviction, but I did not unbuckle the straps that night. What I did was take the ball jar with its folded papers, the oilcloth notebook, and one of the seed jars, small, round seeds I didn't recognize, labeled in my grandfather's hand with a single word I had to hold the lantern close to read. The word was Malvasia. I did not know what that meant yet. I would learn. I climbed back out of the train car with those 3 things under my arm, pulled the door shut behind me, and stood in the trench in the dark with the first snow of November beginning to fall. The snow fell all night. By morning, there were 4 inches on the flat ground, and 6 as where the wind had packed it against the south wall of the cabin. I sat at the table with the 3 things in front of me and a cup of coffee going cold and read every page of the oilcloth notebook twice through. The handwriting was my grandfather's, the same cramped left-leaning script from the birthday cards he sent me until I was 12. The notebook was a planting record, mostly. Dates and rows and rainfall notes going back to 1961. But the last 8 pages were different. They were a letter he never mailed to anyone, as far as I could tell. Maybe he wrote it to whoever came next. Maybe he always knew it would be me. He wrote that the Malvasia was an old grape, Italian, brought over by a man in his own grandfather's time, planted on this slope because the elevation and the drainage reminded someone of a hillside near Matera they would never see again. He wrote that the vines looked dead but weren't. He wrote that the seeds in the small jar were from the last healthy cluster he'd harvested before. His hands gave out, and that they needed cold stratification over winter, and planting in April when the ground reached 45 degrees. He wrote, and I had to read this part 3 times, that the vineyard had never fully died, that what looked like dead canes were dormant root systems waiting for someone who knew enough to cut back to the live wood and wait. I did not know enough, not yet, but I had the notebook. I spent that winter reading everything I could find about viticulture, old extension, pamphlets, a beat-up copy of a California wine manual from 1973 I ordered through the county library. I learned what Malvasia was. A white grape, ancient, sweet, capable of surviving in thin, rocky soil if the drainage was right. Our drainage, it turned out, was right. In April, I went back to the vineyard with a pair of loppers and cut every cane back hard, looking for green beneath the gray. Most of them showed it. Not all, but most. I planted the seeds from the jar in starts on the south windowsill in early March. 11 of them germinated. The canvas bundle in the train car I finally opened on a cold afternoon in February. It was a tent, canvas, military, with wooden poles lashed inside. Nothing alarming. I laughed a little when I unbuckled the last strap and understood what it was. The kind of laugh that's mostly relief. The car is still down there. I use it for cold storage now. It holds temperature better than anything I could build. If the mountain teaches you one thing, it's that patience is not passive. It's the most active thing a person can do. Choosing to wait, to watch, to learn the name of the thing before you try to use it. My grandfather knew that. He left the proof of it buried under 30 years of dead vines and the first November snow, waiting for whoever was willing to pry the door open and climb down in the dark. If any of this sounds like your life, or the life you're trying to find, leave it in the comments. Subscribe if you want to see what comes up out of that ground come June.